Welcome to That Good Fight, a Reformation for Gentlemen. My name's Aaron Edwards. I'm joined by Nathan Paler.
Hello.
Hello.
Yeah.
No Tom Chaldecott.
No, unfortunately not.
It's just the two of us, which may account for any sound issues.
Yeah, that's entirely on us, I'm afraid.
It's entirely expected, likely, plausible and inevitable that there will be sound issues today.
100% agreed.
with what we have here. But we thought today would be a good opportunity to kind of, I guess it continues some of the themes we've been talking about, but it's something that like crystallizes a bit more specifically relating to British Christianity and maybe British evangelicalism in general. So we're going to be talking about what is it about British evangelicalism, and you could extend it to British Christianity in general, but because we're evangelicals, that's kind of where we're coming from. Why is there this weird, strange, knee-jerk reaction against anything right-wing? And in many ways, we've spoken about some of these things before. We don't want to just cover the same ground over and over. We're not just becoming a right-wing politics podcast. But even that concern that kind of might arise in your own mind is kind of odd. It's sort of part of the conditioning of the left. It's the conditioning that you will not go in this direction. You will not veer over here. So I thought, there's a few things that have come up even recently that that kind of speak into this, and we'll get into that in a minute. But any kind of opening comments, salvos from the great Dr. Paler on why you think that there is a default setting within British evangelicals towards a leftward drift, a leftward form of politics, and therefore, in a way, theology. Even if some may be conservative card carriers, theologically, they're almost always going to be leftward in their socio-politics.
It's difficult, isn't it? Even as I was walking down after parking the car just to come here, I was thinking about this, knowing we were going to talk about this subject, and thinking there are so many factors here, so many historical factors and theological factors. And one of the questions I had in my mind, not to throw a question back at a question, but was it the case 20, 30 years ago? Like when we were forming our nascent Christian faith, when you were a teenager and I was a teenager, or early 20s, was it the same? Do you think? It's a question at you.
Well, I don't know if I was aware of it to the same extent, other than I think it was the same. Like I said, I wasn't a Christian until I was 16. So I didn't have the same lens for it, but I definitely had a consciousness, as most British people would, of the Voldemort of the far right. So you'd only ever hear, you'd never hear from them. You'd only ever hear about them.
Well, this is what I'm thinking. I'm casting my mind back. What would it be? Let's say we're in our late 30s now. So thinking back to early 2000, year 2000, that sort of time. What was the overarching impression of the church back then, the evangelical church? Well, I remember watching interviews on like Newsnight and things, and they'd sometimes get the representative from a Christian party or something, and he'd be wheeled in as the weirdo. Yeah. The slightly strange chap who will talk about, eccentric conservative things. And even then, even though I was in a church circle thinking, oh, blimey, I don't want to be like him, or thinking this guy's a bit peculiar, isn't he? But generally, I mean, I've certainly found in the last 10 or 15 years a change. I've seen the leftward drift of the church. And I think maybe it didn't start 20 years ago. Maybe it started well before then, and we can think about some factors. But I definitely think it's accelerated in the last 10 or 15 years. And I'm trying to figure out all the reasons why. So let me go back to the beginning. Let me try as best as I can. So there's always been, you know this as well as I do, Aaron, if not better, that there's been a social aspect to evangelicalism in the UK, specifically. In the UK tradition of evangelicalism, as we've said before, there's like American evangelicalism, there is continental evangelicalism. Even those terms mean something different in those different places. But the tradition of UK evangelicalism and English UK evangelicalism more specifically, what do we have? Well, we have the sort of Wesleyan, Whitfieldian, reformist, Wilberforcian reformist aspect of evangelicalism that would have a social consciousness, is what I'm saying. So there's always some association in the last 200 years or so between evangelicalism and some policies that would now be described as left-wing, which we would, in the context, have probably said were necessary. Like, I don't know, I'm trying to think of some examples, like slavery, for example, but perhaps also issues of workers' rights and suffrage and other things, potentially. You know, I know there are debates on these things.
Homosexuality as well.
Yeah.
You know, it was illegal for for the first half of the 20th century at least. So
So there's always been an association between UK evangelicalism, and when I say always, I mean for the last 200, 300 years, there's been an association between UK evangelicalism and reformist policies, which we now associate with left-wing.
Yeah.
But then I'm thinking back, okay, the last 70 years, let's just think about that. I do as well think that the last 70 years, certainly after World War II, the UK in general has seen a sympathy for socialist policies, a sympathy for left-wing ideals, and that became like the post-war consensus, for lack of a better phrase. Right? It did certainly here. You know, the idea of the state having a larger and larger role invaded not just the minds of the degenerate, you know, non-Christian, but invaded the minds of ordinary believers.
Well, it was William Temple, Archbishop, wasn't it, who was a key figure in imagining the NHS.
Yeah,
I don't know if he's the architect of it, but I think he was one who pushed for it. It was often seen as someone who's a significant champion and influential on it.
Yeah.
So you think you can't. It's very hard to roll that back and go, well, an NHS may just think, oh, it's just a one policy decision relating to healthcare. No, it's actually changed the consciousness of the nation.
This is, I mean, it's one of Charles Taylor's really helpful phrases, the social imaginary. You know, that idea of there being almost like the oxygen that we breathe, the prevailing assumption of the time. And in this case, the social imaginary after World War II definitely shifted to a more statist focus. And it wasn't that. And when we say that, we're saying that not just for non-Christians, but for Christians too, evangelicals included. So that increasingly, evangelicals would have had a space carved out in their minds for the state to take, and they would have seen alternatives to that as like going back to the past, going back to the 30s, going back to the 20s.
Is this also goes back to the post-war consensus and the boomer thing? Which is the idea of there's a certain, I guess, a flaw, and you don't mess with our flaw. This flaw was laid in 1945.
Yeah, exactly.
And it doesn't change. And so
they're going to have that in their heads as well as anyone else does.
And some of it will be the same kind of thing that C.S. Lewis talked about with relation to technology. Like, when you think of That Hideous Strength and the NICE, it's like he's speaking about the statist control of technology to, let's say, destroy nature, or mess with nature, and let's kind of make a massive great leaps forward, because we have a great excuse, because we are trying to win the war here. Come on, just surrender your rights temporarily. We'll give them straight back to you after the war. Oh, well, we haven't got around to giving them all back to you. Okay, we've put this new policy in place. We've now decided cities are going to have to be rebuilt like this. Town planning is going to have to change, and we're going to be in charge of it in this particular way. And we're going to give more and more restrictions, but it's all for the benevolent interests, because we need to rebuild the nation. Either we need to win the war, and then afterwards it's like we need to recover for the war. In a way, it's like a lot of these policies. I guess the grandchildren of some of those policies are still in place today. The bureaucracy, the way that the state just gets on with it, and we just think people who grow up in that, they just go, oh, that's just how it is, and that's good.
Exactly. It's a social imaginary. This is, and again, to repeat, guys, and people who are listening, what we're trying to explain here is why evangelicalism has a leftward, or seems to have a leftward drift, or a leftward a propensity. Leftward propensity, gaze, whichever. I think another thing is cultural, of course, even just in terms of pop culture. I mean, as a child of the 80s, 90s, I've said this before on this podcast, but I remember watching those programs that would, I think I've mentioned this with regard to, forgive me, Enoch Powell.
Oh, yeah,
but do you remember Mary Whitehouse?
No, I know the name. I don't know.
Mary Whitehouse was a moral Christian campaigner in the 1970s and 80s, and
she's the watershed on the TV.
Yep, and she opposed in the 90s. She opposed the Jerry Springer opera for being blasphemous. Now, again, when you watch those talking head shows, when I watched them as a 13-year-old, 14-year-old, they were almost exclusively mocking and scoffing and rejecting, and I think generally, again, you grew up with this sense of, a bit like with that representative from the Christian Party that you'd see on Newsnight, you'd say, well, I don't want to be like those extremist reactionaries. And this connects to another thing, and maybe this is more broad, because this has been around for a long time. It's part of the English mind, really, and it's in large part owing to the Church of England. The English mind, in large part, it wants to, or seeks to avoid extremes. I mean, this is the idea of the Church of England being a via media, and I know that is historically connected to very specific Christian Christian traditions, but as a culture. I mean, Peter Hitchens writes about this, doesn't he? We avoid the Puritans on the one side, we avoid puritanical extremes on either side, and now many have appropriated that to think, well, that means that, you know, whether it's the woke left or the woke right, as some are calling them, and I think it is in the mindset of the Englishman or Englishwoman, and this would include the evangelical, to think that the extreme is the wrong place. The amount of time I've heard, especially from those of older generations recently, but generally, you know, you're very black and white, or we don't want to avoid black and white, we want to be grey, we want to live in the grey. Well, that is again, it's the avoiding extremes mindset, it's the C of E mindset. And I'm not having to go at my Anglican friends there, I'm just saying there is a mindset. So we piece all this together. Evangelicalism in its early formative days with Whitefield, Wesley, Wilberforce had a reformist tendency. You have the social imaginary of the state having more control. You have a pop cultural upbringing in the last 50 years that would look askance at those who would seek to bring a more conservative a conservative correction. And then you've got a general, as it were, Anglican mind, Anglican approach, which wants to try and avoid the extremes, to look decent.
Moderation.
Yes, to look English, and Englishness is decency, and decency is middle ground. And I think that might go somewhere. I'm not at all suggesting it's the entirety, but in my mind that goes somewhere to explaining why this has happened. And then you would combine it, let's say in the short term, the last 10, 15 years, with major cultural changes which were facilitated by institutional changes amongst the elite, which then were pushed down to us through pop culture, which then were pushed down to us through in what we were reading and in the institutions of power in universities. You know, with regard to LGBT things and other things. And evangelicals are as susceptible to that as anyone else.
Well, I would actually say more susceptible. Because, because we've opened the drawbridge to say we're going to go and do all this cultural engagement. We're going to go out there and reach the culture, and really the culture has been reaching us. And that, without realising, that's why, again, that people don't realise that. So you say things, and it takes something like a figure to come up, or something in the news to come up, and someone to step outside the bounds, and we'll get onto that a bit later with some examples, and that's what brings it up, and then suddenly this kind of crazy hatred of the other side of this view comes out. I
will also add one more factor, if that's all right, and it's even just one that's occurred to me as you were saying that, which is that evangelical worship over the last, the evangelical culture over the last, culture of church over the last 40 years has stressed a sort of individualistic authenticity. And we don't have to go too far in this. We don't have to dismiss methods of worship wholesale necessarily. I'm just trying to say that in our worship, in the culture, what has been the priority, not forms that have been imposed on you from church, not, you know, that the most authentic method of expression of worship is the one in which you are most free to be you and God, you know. That you encounter God individually in the worship. It is not handed down to you as a form. It is rather some sort of immanent pneumatic intimacy between you and God. And what I'm saying is we have then in our very culture over the last 40 years inculcated a sense of first of all, anti-doctrine or a-doctrinalism, that we don't actually care for theological things as much as we used to, so the guardrails are down, but then flooding into that, once the guardrails are down, is this sense of authentic individualism, which means that when someone comes and says, well, my authentic individualism suggests that I've been really, you know, damaged by conservative teaching on sexuality, or I've been really damaged by conservative teaching, and you need to listen to my story, everyone is more likely to go, yeah, not only will we listen to your story, we'll affirm everything that you're saying, because after all, it's the authentic inner life that is most important. So I think there's all sorts of things going on. I don't think it's just one thing.
That's a good point, and that does, you know, makes me think of the I've said this many times on podcasts over the last few years, what I observed in the Methodist conference when gay marriage was coming through, and it was that concept of the authenticity of the story of the wounded gay person who'd suffered at the hands of the terrible homophobia, by which they mean not people who are evil and discriminatory against people, but literally like the homophobia baked into scriptural doctrine, which they then will say, well, actually, maybe there's something we can wangle here, maybe we can get a scholar to help us out and change the wording or change what it says. Speaking of which, actually, I as you were saying earlier about the avoiding extremes, I had a verse quoted at me, I think I should say, recently on online, and it was someone who was, I would think I was making a point about this fear of extremism, I wrote a journal article 10 years ago now for the Expository Times, talking about preaching in relation to the idea that preachers should be balanced extremists. In fact, you may well have been present in Edinburgh in 2013 when I gave a theological paper.
Right.
Do you remember that?
I do.
It was on Chesterton and Barth and Lloyd Jones. And I was talking about paradox and dialectic, is what I did my PhD on in the end. So holding these different things in tension, but how does the moment of certainty that comes in preaching, it may seem extreme, and it has to. Like John Knox's preaching doesn't seem... there's a layer of moderation to everything. You are always moderating, but you can even be moderating in extremis, as it were. You can say, I'm speaking on this now, and that's something that. So I think there's a way of being a balanced extremist.
Any preacher who mentions the name of Jesus as being an extremist,
exactly,
by virtue of what does it assume? It assumes all sorts. That there was a man called Jesus. He was who he says he was, and we need to listen to him. That's what an extreme view. I mean, that isn't. I think a lot of the time it's self-deception that they think they are moderates when actually they hold.
Everyone's
just examine.
Exactly.
There's not really such thing as moderation anyway. Everyone holds to extreme positions by virtue of the fact they think they're right about some things.
It's philosophically insane when you think about it. It's just like, that's a very extreme view. Like, what do you mean in relation to what? The crowd,
it's political
the mob?
jargon, isn't it? I mean, have you noticed that's the most sinister part of it? It's taking on the language. I'm seeing a lot of that now, especially say at Watch On Church when we experience opposition and other things. You often get accused of being a cult or being extremists. And what I find most disconcerting about that, and this is where the statism thing comes in, they are echoing the language of the establishment. They are echoing the language that would talk in terms of extremism. Well, historically, we've applied that to Islamic terrorists, but it is a political spectrum that says you've got an acceptable window of views in the middle, and you can't go to the extremes because that's where terrorism is. What a strange and utterly bizarre thing to say about a peaceful church that just happens to believe what they say.
You couldn't say pluck out your eye if it causes you to sin. That would sound extreme. You couldn't say go and tie a millstone around your neck and chuck yourself in the sea. That would be extreme.
I'd be really... It's like Jefferson's Bible, where he chopped out all the miraculous bits. I'd be really curious to know what a church that actually tries to avoid being extreme would really look like if they really took it seriously.
We actually need to, we should own it as a badge of honor and go, we are extremists. Like, if Jesus said, you lose your life for my sake, you will find it. If you try and keep hold of your life, well, can I just keep hold of a bit of my life? Like, no, he says, you have to give your whole life to Jesus. So if he says, go here, you go there. If he says, believe this, you believe it. If he says, do that, do this, you do it.
Absolutely.
And that's what it means to be a Christian extremist.
And also, if extremism, as you say, in extremis, in the outer parts, that's etymologically, I just think it's really on the outer parts. Well, on the outer parts of you could say that in various ways. On the outer parts of history, the current moderates of the church, the current moderate evangelicals, so-called, the ones who would seek to not be too extreme, they're wets indeed, are themselves, as it were, extremists in the context of history. They are on the they're on the hinterlands of Christian doctrine,
in the outer darkness.
When you, I'm teaching church history at the moment, and you read even the most average piece of writing from a 2nd, 3rd century Christian. Honestly, you would write that on Twitter, and you'd get, or whatever it's called now, you'd get. By some of these moderate liberal types, you would get assaulted for being a bigot. Christians have sounded extreme all the time for 21 centuries.
But here's the thing I was going to say. Here's the verse that was quoted at me. I think you mentioned earlier also that things that people have read, and sometimes Bible translations can get interesting. So Ecclesiastes 7:18.
Okay.
It is good to grasp this is the NIV. The beloved NIV of evangelicalism. It is good to grasp the one and not let go of the other. Whoever fears God will avoid all extremes. Right? Now, it does say in the footnote for the NIV, or will follow them both, rather than will avoid all extremes. The ESV, of course, ESV not being perfect, but as a slightly more literal approach, or significantly more so than the NIV. So rather than saying whoever fears God will avoid extremes, it says, for the one who fears God shall come out from both of them. That's a very different thing.
Well, of course, it's a very, very different
thing. Shall
thing.
come out from both of them means you're holding... Yes. In a way, that's what I'm arguing earlier, balanced extremism. You're saying you are dialectically, you are able to go here and to go here.
Yes.
You're able to go left and you're able to go right. And what may be perceived as this or that. And I think this is so different to say if you fear God, you will avoid all extremes. That's someone going, basically that's what he means. That's what the NIV does all the time. this is basically what he's getting at.
Oh, that's such a silly thing to say. That's what the author intended.
Like, isn't that perfect? Isn't that just the problem? Like, people read that in the Bible and they go, God's word says I should avoid all extremes. So
even though in the very same book, I've even got it here, fear God, keep his commandments, this is the whole duty of man, for God will bring every deed into judgment, every secret thing, whether good or evil. What an extreme position on the judgment of God.
I know.
But it's silly. That's not what it's saying.
They choose their fridge magnet verse. And that's what was quoted to me because of something I was saying online, which, again, we can kind of get into. But, so it's just an interesting backdrop. So I think we'll now move... We're gonna play a little clip now, okay? So this is somebody who is the responding to we in our last episode which was delayed in in release, but so it looked like we're kind of reporting on like 2-week-old news or something. this probably all the same, but we were talking about Donald Trump's first few days in office, JD Vance and people like that, and the whole attitude, well, the whole kind of gung-ho attitude they have. Now, one of those things you see is them getting tough on immigration in the US, and JD Vance, who is definitely a professing and avowed Christian, I think he's definitely a Christian. I don't know what I could say about Donald Trump, probably not. But anyway, Vance was involved in a discussion with someone who's picking at him on this immigration policy. I mean, he's just saying, look, we're America first. We're saying we need to deport illegal immigrants, and we need to care for our own first. And
basically what we discussed in a previous episode.
Yeah, exactly.
With the Russian doll thing.
Absolutely, yeah. And so and then he cites on I think it's on Twitter, he cites the kind of doctrine of ordered love.
I'd like to say we did get there first. We did talk about this in the episode.
Yeah, that is.
We did actually talk about this.
Yeah, that's good, isn't it?
Before
I know, how annoying. We should have got that out.
Yeah.
But then we have British evangelicals like Krish Kandiah, who is Americans won't even know who he is, but he was the principal of London School of Theology not that long ago. He's a big person on social justice issues.
He's a big Eva of UK evangelicalism. He's part of it.
Kind of, but I don't even he's not really that prominent on the platform.
There isn't really much big about. There's not much big about Big Eva of UK.
It's just like
mid-Eva,
limp Eva. I don't know what it is, but British evangelicalism is very depressing. But Krish Kandiah, so he's your principal of London School of Theology, which is the biggest Bible college in the country by a long way. And so he had that only for a short time, and then he did other charity work. He's often speaking on these issues, but he will always come out with a lefty type opinion, and it's just really interesting to observe it. So here's what he said.
He did an FIEC conference, FIEC seminar during COVID about woke stuff, and was of course carrying water for wokeness as well, for the idea of woke. Of course, very explicitly.
Yeah, and exactly. So here's the clip of him responding to JD Vance. Of course, he gets involved when he wants to.
JD Vance, the Vice President of the United States, has been talking a lot about love, and specifically what the Bible has to say about love. He says that you should love God, then you should love your family, then you should love your neighbour, then you should love your community, then you should love your country, and then, and only then, should you love people from other countries around the world. It's his justification for the America First policy. It's why the government of America has stopped funding all of its international aid and development programs. And he says that's justifiable on biblical grounds. But it's interesting, he kind of tripped over this promise or this command that we're supposed to love our neighbours. When Jesus was asked the two greatest commandments, he said, love God and love your neighbour. And when asked, who is my neighbour? He said, actually, here's a little parable. A Jewish man was walking down the road and he was assaulted and left for dead, and two other Jewish men came to him and walked by on the other side of the road and did nothing to help, but a Samaritan stopped and helped and offered assistance at great personal cost. The Samaritan was not ethnically connected to him, he was not even necessarily faith connected to him, and he was definitely not the same nationality. And yet this was the pinnacle, the example of love that Jesus chose to show what loving your neighbour meant. So if I have to pick JD Vance or Jesus, I'm going to pick Jesus every day of the week. We must be very careful of requisitioning the Christian faith to support our nationalistic ideologies. We've got to allow Jesus to challenge us. He's the Lord and King of the universe. He's the ruler of all the world. He loves every single person on this planet. And he doesn't have favourites. He loves every person in every nation. And therefore, to choose one nation at the expense of all the others is not fair to the Christian faith. Now, yes, I have responsibilities as a father to my biological kids. But you know what? I also am told in the Bible I've got to care for the widow and the orphan. That's other people's families. That's part of our calling as Christians, is to show the love of God. In fact, that's one of the ways that Christianity stands out from other faiths. There's hardly a faith in the world that doesn't tell you to care for your own. But Jesus tells us to care for people that we don't have a biological connection with. That's when love begins to shine, when we break down barriers and show the grace and love of God to those that need it. I'm sorry, Mr. Vice President. I'd love a longer conversation with you about this. I hope we can do that soon. Thanks.
That bit at the end was I found really interesting, especially because it was like kind of posturing like, hey, let me get involved with these kind of high-powered... Vice President, could you come and talk to me?
It's almost aggressively misinformed.
Yes, yeah.
We're recording, by the way, I'm assuming.
Yeah,
we're okay. Just checking, because we had this audio going at the time. But it's almost aggressively misinformed on almost every level.
Yeah.
I mean, where do you begin with that?
I mean, yeah.
Where do you begin with that?
Well, I think it's interesting because there'll be some evangelicals who hear those kind of clips who don't see it. So hopefully we can actually help show why...
Okay,
why this is more surreptitious, because it looks to some they'll be like, but isn't that right? Isn't that what Jesus wants us to do? Doesn't he want us to love people? And isn't the Good Samaritan about breaking down those barriers? Because they've heard that in the gospel presentations they've received for so long. This is what distinguishes Christianity from everything else, is because we are Marxist almost. Almost. That's the way that, now Jesus does break down barriers. Of course he does. Of course, as we see in the New Testament and in the epistles, you see no slave, no free, no Jew, no Greek, etc. But the whole notion of that it overcomes and overrides the order amoris, the sense of that there is an order to your love, is insane.
Oh my word, where do you begin with this? I think that there's obviously a scriptural level. So it says in 1 Timothy, hang on, let me just get the actual passage up here, folks, rather than me just paraphrase it. Well, yeah, of course there are several. Yeah, of course. This is 1 Timothy 5. Bear with me one second, everyone. Honour widows who are truly widows. It's in the context of the widows list. But if a widow has grandchildren, has children or grandchildren, let them first learn to show godliness to their own household, and to make some return to their parents, for this is pleasing in the sight of God. And it carries on, if anyone does not provide for his relatives, and especially for members of his household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an unbeliever. So there is a superficial level of, we could just appeal to scriptures, not just those, but others that speak about households, and households in private is in... smaller households inform the bigger picture, as we talked about more in that previous episode. We could talk about all that, and that there's actually a fundamental biblical illiteracy going on. When Jesus talks about loving your neighbour, and they can be of any ethnic stripe, of course that's true, but these things should not be thrown into contradiction with one another, because they don't contradict. What Vance is saying, and what the Ordo Amorum is actually saying, is that there are kinds of love. First of all, there are different species of love, and finite resources that any one individual has to show that love. So I know this is like blindingly obvious, but like the love that you have for your children is going to be very different than the love that you have for me. I don't have a problem with that.
I think he was my child.
Okay, of course, of course. And morality insists, and indeed it is generally not just in culture, not just in it's not some pagan thing, it's in human nature. It is natural law, if anything else, and revealed, as we've just read in 1 Timothy 5, that if I would be disappointed if you did anything else. If a bus was coming down the road and he was going to hit me or your child, you rescue your child. It's obvious. It's really, really obvious. And
it's an ongoing analogy, isn't it, for the love of God, in the sense we are His children, and so the way that you see Him, maybe non-Calvinists would find this harder because they kind of just hope. Often, especially Universalists, which many evangelicals are actually closet Universalists anyway. So the very notion that God would reject those who are not His children anyway, theologically that's part of the problem.
Indeed,
we can go, look, we are, firstly, He chooses Israel.
I was about to say, does Christ love the church more than He does any other people on earth? What do you do with that? This is the bonkers thing. I understand that there's sort of like a latent Arminianism in Christianity, not to get into that sort of doctrinal hot topic, but I just mean I understand that that's in his thinking. But even on a non-reformed reading, Christ loves the church differently, and surely in a species unique fashion compared to how he loves, I don't know, Canaan or Philistia, or
Moab.
Of course, I mean, if you deny that, I don't know what else to say to you.
Who's referred to as his wash basin.
Exactly.
Like,
exactly, which he throws a shoe at.
Yeah.
Like, what do you do? I mean, the thing is, it's so obvious. You almost feel like you're explaining 101 doctrine here. But we're going to have to, as you say, it's worth us picking it up.
It goes back to the foundation, doesn't it? Because it's like the roots aren't there. I think so. This is what's really. I don't want to become a. I found there's an interesting article by Jake. Was it Jake Meador for Mere Orthodoxy recently? I saw J.B. Bambrick post about it. Who's kind of comparing people like us in this sort of, right-leaning or right-wing Christianity to the emerging church people, because it's sort of like post-evangelical. Because you're so critical of evangelicalism, it's like you're deconstructing evangelicalism. I can see some analogies to you are deconstructing some of what has been said, but in a way, but it's actually as we would prefer the phrase reforming, because you're reforming based on the actual principles that you believe and were taught is the actual gospel you've received. But then you realise over time there's something about a veneer of that gospel becomes a veneer to some people. And it's like, I love the bit the bit where God loves everyone unconditionally. I love the bit where he just supplies my emotional needs, and rather than actually the full-orbed sense of the love of God, which includes his judgment and includes his rejection of those who are not his people.
Absolutely. And notice as well, by the way, how he said that these ideas of the Ordo Amorum are informing nationalist policies, as opposed to his ideas of love for neighbour informing his much more leftist doctrine about immigration, which I know he has. This is the thing. It's almost like it's good, it's all right for one, but it's not all right for another. And I'm allowed to do it, but you're not allowed to do it. That is frustrating. But not on a fundamental level. It's been embarrassing watching these people engage with the Ordo Amorum, because it's certainly, you see it in Augustine, you see it in Aquinas, you see it in the scriptures, you see it in natural law. When he's talking about pagans and other religions, it's because it's a sense of the divine. It's something, when Paul says that the name, the Father is by which every family in heaven derives its name. So households play such a central part, to such a central role, I beg your pardon, in not just the biblical mindset, but just in the nature of man. And it is, as we explained in that previous episode, what we're saying and what Vance is saying is not controversial, if only because it's an analogy from the household. Your love for your child is different, even to your love for Molly, your wife. It is different from the love to your neighbour, and your resources as a human being are finite, and as such, you have to and you must choose, or else it is immoral otherwise, to prefer one in a different way than you would the other. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not still loving your next door neighbour, or you're not loving the random person who you meet on the street. You're not loving anyone else. You are, but you're just loving differently, and in a way that honours, as Paul says, redeem the time, in a way that honours the finite resources you have, and in a way that honours your obligations and your vocation as a father. In the same way, by the analogy from that, that there's a need for towns to look after its townsfolk, and to do that in a way that prefers that townsfolk to other townsfolk. It would be madness, say, here in Alfreton, for the mayor of Alfreton to care more about the people of Loughborough than the people of Alfreton. Well, imagine spend all their time talking about Loughborough.
I mean, imagine taking the vast majority of the resources given, the vast majority of the tax money, we're going to help build a town hall over here. Oh, but we don't even have healthy sanitation in this town. Yeah, but we want to follow Jesus, and he says we should help other people first, because otherwise we'll be really selfish. So let's do that, and let's just hope someone might help us out. Okay, I mean,
it is risible, by the way. We should laugh at this because it's like, it's childlike, and I say that not as an insult to Christiandia, but I have been amazed at the response, at how misinformed it really is, to a point where you feel like you're being trolled or something. Am I missing something?
I haven't been slightly surprised, by the way. I'm not amazed by it. I'm like, this is how they would react, because for them this is like an absolute. They think of this as a free hit. That's why I say you're right to say it's embarrassing to watch, because they think of this as like, what?
Yeah.
Obviously. Obviously the Good Samaritan, guys, because that's all I ever talk about.
Yeah.
So it's like the only thing that really informs my Christianity is this kind of full-orbed, completely indiscriminate, just blanket love for everyone at all times, with no borders whatsoever, no hierarchies, no order. That's how they think. So when they see someone like Vance just coming straight out with it, and I think the issue is that for them, that Vance quoted, did he quote the Bible, or did he just say it was a Christian doctrine? I forget. He clearly linked it explicitly to Christianity, and so it was really interesting that that became an issue they could jump on and go, oh my goodness, the vice president of the US is making a kind of Christian nationalist type of point, so we're going to do our own form of Christian nationalism back, because that's what they're doing. They want to inform the government to be informed by Christian virtue. As soon as you do that, you believe you want some kind of a Christian nation. Christian Kandahar is a Christian nationalist because he wants the nation to follow the Good Samaritan rather than some pagan doctrine. But even though he's happy for them to kind of continue to go their pagan way in loads of other respects.
You're right. They are responding because they think it's an easy win, and they're almost, in its confusion it hurt itself. That sort of thing. In its confusion it hurt itself. That's kind of what's going on. In order to get back at him, you're right. They've taken this most ludicrous position. And I should say, one of the best responses I've seen to it has been, and this still doesn't meet the essence of it, by the way. I still don't think it actually defeats the original point, but it's one of the better responses. Has been
other than my one.
Of course. It's been to say, well, the nature of divine love is different to human love, and so we need to think more deeply about divine love. And I do actually think love is a really important theme. A theology that sings at Watchon, the Bible study we do here, we're just finishing our systematic theology, and we're going to talk more about the love of God. I do believe, actually, we need to take it back from progressives as conservatives, specifically as conservatives, and say it really is at the heart of all things. When Paul says in Ephesians that love binds everything together in a perfect harmony, there is... No, sorry, that's Colossians. There is something really profound about that, and it is true that God's love is categorically different. It is deep. It is endless. It is precisely is the point. It is infinite. It is not finite. The point is that when He creates us in time, He tasks us to express that divine love in spheres and stations and vocations that are by definition finite. When He's called you to be a father, that's a finite vocation. You have a limited amount of years on earth, limited amount of money, limited amount of time to spend with your kids or anyone else, and you have to fulfill that vocation, you have to be selective. But because you love your children, you can then, when someone comes up to you, let's say a homeless person comes up to you on the street, as your neighbour, this is the Samaritan, a homeless person comes up to you on the street and you get talking to them, and they say something like, I never had a dad, or my dad left me when I was 8. Oh, I never really had much. He didn't really care for me. It is because you love your children the way you should that you can love Him in a way that is actually Christ-like. And you can say, I have, with the consolation we have received, we console others, that sort of thing.
And similarly to G.K. Chesterton's point on nations, you won't learn how to love your own. Another man's love for his nation, you won't understand it unless you love your own.
Absolutely.
It's like basic kind of common sense, you say natural law, but it's something again that's maybe germane to people on the right, in the sense of that focus of I don't want to say that common sense is a feature of the right, but it does seem to be, at least in our time. And I guess there is a sense of like it is closer to I think I could say that, because it's saying that right wing or right leaning thinking tends to be, I would say, more based in reality. I guess maybe the further right. If you're getting more close to the further left, because you're going, it's more ideological and going right. I'm going to impose an ideology that is actually foreign to reality. We're basing it in reality.
That's basically right. And even if we don't like the language of right and left, we're talking about conservatism, things that are handed on, permanent things. Like one of the images I saw on Twitter, I've not looked much at all this on exchange back and forwards, but on one of the ones I did see, is a meme that I'd used an image from Sophie's Choice. So it's a mum like holding onto 2 children. One of them is labelled in the meme your child, and the other one is random kid, or like something like random neighbour or something like that. You have to let go of one. Which do you let go? And the response again, this, as you say, it's the embarrassing nature of it. They feel like they have to respond to this. They feel like they're getting one over, and so they're forced into absurdity. I literally saw people on that saying, "Well, I would try and choose both," or it's not about that. So, and one of the responses said, "Okay, if you really believe that, then could you please give me the same amount of money you're going to spend on your kids' college fund? Could you please wire that to me in a minute?" And of course they don't. Of course they don't.
They don't ever practice what they preach. Jamie Bambrick actually did a really funny one for. I think he said, "My wife just made me and my children pancakes this morning. I'm so sorry. I want to publicly apologise that she didn't make them for the entire population of Chad.
That is brilliant.
And so I feel like I should be in repentance now.
That is great.
But this is part of the feature of the kind of anti-right kind of thinking that we see in the church. This is one feature. The Ordo Amoris is one of those that suddenly just comes up. But like I said, it takes something like, these debates aren't just happening. It takes something to happen. Someone goes, and then it exposes something. So like it exposes the stuff that was laying there for decades, that people had been ignoring parts of the Bible, like the parts you cited from the pastoral epistles, which is just really obvious. But they're probably things that people have, obviously they're doing their Nicky Gumbel, lightly edited NIV in a year type reading. So they're reading these passages every year, but they have this box in their mind, which is like, when they get to something that sounds a bit right wing, that sounds a bit like care for your own first. But that's what right wing people.
That's just
think.
The Bible being weird.
And I'm not. Yeah, and I'm not allowed. Not allowed to.
Yeah.
You're not allowed to think like that. Yeah, that's why we're weird. That's something that just, they have their context card. Culture context. It just doesn't belong. I don't really know what that means. Caring for widows, I guess the equivalent of that is whatever I'm currently doing in my church, food banks or something.
As if the whole Bible isn't cultural in some way, or the whole Bible isn't weird, really, if you think about it.
Yeah.
God that exists outside of all time. Has entered his own creation, has raised from the dead. Like, the whole Bible is weird. It's selective weirdness, selective appeals to culture. That's what frustrates me.
And it's very middle class, of course. This is part of the other issue. So this is where, like, to go to another, we'll show another clip briefly to get up ready. There was, there's the divisive figure in our culture, which I think is now becoming known in the US as well and beyond, is Tommy Robinson. I mean, again, just seen as kind of like the Voldemort. I'd not really followed anything to do with Tommy Robinson until a couple of years ago, when I heard a few podcasts, him telling his story and stuff, and I kind of thought, whenever his name had come up, I just think, oh, okay, again, it's the Voldemort effect, kind of crazy. So then I saw him speaking on Jeremy Paxman, I think it was, maybe 12 years ago, like he was quite young. And you could see Paxman was a really reasonable, the Newsnight presenter back in the day. He was a reasonable guy, and quite conservative. You could see in his principles, and but he would still grill right and left as part of his journalistic endeavour. And he was really going to town, trying to show Tommy Robinson in a bad light, I think. Yeah. Well, no, let's say trying to kind of expose him, and he was just very reasonable. He'd be, let's say it would be something like, I mean, look at all of this hateful rhetoric you have about Muslims. No, not hate. No, here's the issue. Have you read the Quran? And usually he'll tell the presenter, have you read the Quran? This is why that's why I oppose Islam, and this is why I think Islam is ideologically a problem.
Well, he wasn't an approved voice, was he? He was lower class. Yeah. He spoke with an Essex accent.
Yeah. And of course, salty language. He does swear a lot.
He's very immoderate. So he wasn't trying to be decent and going the middle way. So of course, that interview was quite shameful, really, on Paxman's part.
And also, quite mocking. Even worse was Piers Morgan, I think, on Good Morning Britain. He really went to him, and he literally, Robinson's giving some quite reasonable response to something, just asking him a question back. And I can't hear any more of this. I can't. It's like, of course you can't, Piers.
It's all theatre, isn't it?
It is theatrical.
It's the theatre of. It's like shame. You may as well. Is it a game? I haven't watched Game of Thrones, but there's that clip that often gets rounded of the woman like stripped naked, and she's walking down, and they're all shouting shame at her and throwing like excrement at her. That's basically what those interviews are.
That's what they want to do.
Parade the monkey out and object to him.
They're not interested in what's actually true. And ironically, that's the whole. Tommy Robinson's whole shtick has been like, I'm trying to tell the truth. Now he may not be a perfect man, of course. Like these other divisive figures, like a Trump, or before that a Jordan Peterson, maybe, who's become a little bit more moderate in ways, but was seen as a similar kind of Voldemort that you'd have to surreptitiously admit that you liked or read some of. And I think Robinson, for many Guardian reading evangelicals, just don't understand. So Brett Murphy, a good friend of mine up in Morecambe, he's a kind of controversial Free Church of England pastor, actually post Free Church of England. He got kicked out of the Free Church of England. And we'll have him onto the podcast and tell his story, because it's absolutely mad. But he was invited to speak, partly because he speaks on these cultural issues a lot, at the Tommy Robinson rally very recently. And when I posted something about this, I got all sorts of flack from people I know, from other churches I've been in, and this kind of thing, of people who they just don't, and they're like, I can't believe you're championing this person who champions someone like Tommy Robinson, this evil man almost, who's in contempt of court. And you're like, yes. That's almost like the worst thing you could possibly do. Like, he's evil. I can't believe you'd say he's a truth teller. You know, he's telling lies about this poor Palestinian man, and that's why it's nothing to do with him being a political prisoner. You think, no, if you know anything about his story, look, I'm not like a major TR fan, but I just think it's quite...
And ironically, he was in contempt of court because he released the documentary about the Palestinian boy, which when you actually watch it, you're like, well, there are definitely questions here. There are definitely some questions. I mean, even if it doesn't eventually favour Tommy Robinson, but you're definitely like, oh, there are definitely... He's raising some questions that need to be answered.
But that's the thing. The middle class mindset is like, he did something against the current establishment, the system, and they are perfect in every way. If the judge said this, then he must be right. And I was like, that isn't true. I know that's not the case, even from personal experience, the way some of these processes work. So anyway, let's play this clip of Brett Murphy doing his speech at the event in London the other day.
Have we got a reverend in the house? I believe we have. Thank you, Liam. What an encouragement to see so many patriotic people gathered today, and thank you for the opportunity to speak. Let me bounce off Liam there and say, I want to bring you a message of hope in the midst of darkness. If you look back through the history of our great nation, you will find time and time again she has faced down insurmountable odds where the forces of evil looked like they would win. And yet, by the grace of God, who made Britain mighty, he makes her mightier yet. If you flick through history, you will see brave, heroic figures who do not bow down to evil. Think of King Alfred the Great, Queen Elizabeth I, Horatio Lord Nelson, Sir Winston Churchill, and Tommy Robinson. We must not give in to the forces of darkness which have gripped our country. And I believe we are facing the greatest threat this nation has ever seen in its long and glorious history. And the worst thing about that is the forces of Satan have infiltrated our very nation. We face a threat from within, twofold, from weak and corrupt government who bow down to evil, and from forces of outside worldviews. And I'm of course talking about extremist Islamist worldviews, which are incompatible with the Christian values of the United Kingdom. Our nation will be overwhelmed, as a friend and brother in Christ of mine said, if we don't stand now, we will kneel in the future. So we must stand with Tommy and all those who are willing to speak the truth. For if a man can be thrown into prison, in a political prison, as Tommy has been, anyone could be. We must not allow our country to be swallowed up by the gaping maws of evil which would seek to see our awesome country obliterated. I want to give you an encouragement, and I want to make an apology. I'm sorry it's me talking to you. I am just a silly Australian who came here 7 years ago with rose-coloured glasses, and what I found is a nation in distress. It should be the Archbishop of York or the Archbishop of Canterbury on this stage. But the Church of England, which I left, which I call the cult of England, should hang its head in shame. But do not lose heart. God is not done with the United Kingdom yet. There is a revival happening of people who are seeking truth, and they are finding it in Jesus Christ. He is King of the United Kingdom. And I tell you what, if you turn to him, you will find the greatness that made our country awesome to begin with. I'm going to conclude with a short scripture, and I believe it applies to our country today. Chapter 7 of the second book of Chronicles, chapter 14. If my people, which are called by my name, says God, shall humble themselves, pray, and seek my face, and turn from wicked ways, I will hear them from heaven, I will forgive their sin, and I will heal their land. If we turn back to God, he will heal the United Kingdom, and he will expunge it of the evil which is set as a rot in our nation. So I want to encourage you, don't lose hope. There are good churches out there. Don't go to the Cult of England or other woke churches. Find a good biblical church with a pastor who has the balls to speak the truth. And be with like-minded people so we can form strong Christian communities again. Don't let them bully you into silence, but stand firm. Now, my brother in Christ and one of my best friends, Father Calvin Robinson, has got in trouble for a hand gesture recently. And my wife said, keep your hands at your side, dear, or it's divorce. So, even though that's a sin. So, I thought we could do a great British gesture, inspired by the man whose statue is just in the square down there. How's about we say, V for victory! Free Tommy Robinson! And make Britain Christian again!
Okay. So, that was Brett Murphy speaking at the Tommy Robinson rally. And there'll be things about that, I'm sure, that, you know, that could grate on some people, for sure. There's exaggerations, maybe, and hyperbole. I'm not sure I would put Tommy Robinson in the line with, like, Nelson and Alfred. No, I certainly wouldn't. But I think if I was being charitable, because I know Brett and I think he's a really great guy, and I think he's really courageous in speaking. The reason he's asked to speak at those and not the Archbishop of Canterbury, York, is because he's willing to speak into this moment, and so few Christian leaders are, because they don't want to. They want to keep their powder dry for the right moment that will never arrive. When do they think this revival is going to happen that they're praying for and that they're apparently preaching into and going through their motions of their churches that hardly ever grow, really, and or at least that they are depleted in the same level as which they grow? We have been such a fallow period for the church and for the nation, and because we've been scared of connecting I guess the church's prophetic voice to the affairs of the nation, we've been unwilling to speak as Brett, even though it's an Australian, though part of the kind of, you know, Commonwealth. He's wanting to come and reclaim some of that heritage. And we're just too scared to kind of go there. Now, like I said, it doesn't mean that you have to kind of agree with absolutely everything or even every way of putting it. But there's something about the way he spoke there that too few people speak that way. And it's not just because he's an extremist. I know he used the word extremist for Islam. I was like, oh, okay. But it's also because you look at church history and there's people who did speak like that about the nation. I mean, even in our time, there's a sermon I often recommend people who Terry Virgo's sermons on Joseph from the early 80s. He's speaking about the moral degradation of the country. And I think he uses the phrase, Britain was great when it was more Christian, something like that. Or at least when and now we're losing, we're losing our grip on the Sabbath, as it were, or losing our sense of the Sabbath because of trading laws changing and things like this. These things, he even then, as a charismatic evangelical leader in the pietistic tradition, happily would say this is. Britain was great because it was adhering to God's law, effectively, God's word, and principles throughout the nation, throughout the policies and governmental procedures. Now it isn't, and now the moral decline is correlated, and so Brett's just doing the same thing there, really. So people who listen to that go, "Oh, that's a bit strong, it's a bit extreme, it's a bit nationalistic." But it's like, what kind of nation do you want to live in? Do you want to live in a nation that's affected by the virtue and piety of Christ, as we have had historically, or do you think that every kind of appeal to any sense of Christian England is completely made up, completely mythological, and therefore we just have to keep going in this brilliant, enclave of the church, which we've carried on saying is the way to do it, when it isn't the way that it's always been done? It's not how churches have always operated, it's how we've operated in the last 50 to 80 years, and it's been pretty ineffective and pretty unfaithful. It's not like there's a great amount of fruit I can look to at the church of the last 100 years, say, and go, oh, this is so good. Like, it's clearly been so fruitful comparative to church history. No, it hasn't. So maybe there's something about this weird cutting off of our socio-political nose, as it were, that's born this kind of fruit, and our knee-jerk reaction to someone like Brett, as I received when I just posted a kind of commendation of him to say, well done, well done, Brett, for speaking this. And by the way, he gave out gospels, tracts. People gladly took it. These people were hungry to hear about Christ. Maybe they don't always know enough about him, but what a great opportunity that most church leaders in this country wouldn't have. I think there are a couple of things that strike me about that clip. So you're right. I first watched that on Sunday, and I only caught the first minute of bits where I stopped at about where he compared Tommy Robinson to Alfred the Great. I was thinking, Brett,
I'm not sure about that.
Yeah.
But listening to the whole thing there, I think that's the first time I actually heard it in its fullness, properly speaking. Forgive me, Brett, if you're listening. Yeah, it's much better than my first impression, and I actually think that I was thinking to myself, if I was asked to do that, what would I say? You know how I said before in a previous podcast about Jo, my wife Jo, sorry. Aaron knows who Jo is, but my wife Jo, and she was talking with non-Christian friends about swearing, and she just said it really, really simplistically, in a really good way. Like really simple. Well, God just doesn't like swearing. I just really like this, because if we had said it, we're like, well, yeah, there's this and there's this and there's that.
Yeah.
Forgive me, Brett, if you're listening. I hope this is not an insult. In fact, it's intended as a compliment. I actually really like the simplicity of Brett Murphy, because there are ways in which he's speaking that I think if we were asked, we would, well, maybe not. We'd hope we'd do better. But yeah, our temptation would definitely be to caveat, to qualify, to make it sound a bit more, basically to do a bit of fancy footwork. What is clear about Brett from not just from, yes, exactly. Not just what's clear about Brett, not just from that, but from other things I've listened to, is that he is willing to sound very simple in his message. And I say that as no insult whatsoever. I actually think there's great profundity and simplicity and in saying things as they really are. As you say, the sort of language he's using there about the country is language that we would have been more than comfortable with, I don't know, 100 or so years ago. Actually, as Aaron was speaking there, I was trying to find an image that I had. And this is a hymn, that is on my phone. This is a hymn from the 19th century. Can I read this out?
You have to specify it on your phone, as if you're like looking through like a manuscript.
Old hymn book, yeah.
I've got this
like
Gandalf in Minister.
Yeah.
To go these old scrolls. Go on.
So this is, I'll see, I might not read all of this, but it says, God bless our native land. May heaven's protecting hands still guard our shore. May peace, this is in a hymn book, by the way. So this was a church hymn book. May peace her power extend, for be transformed to friend, and Britain's rights depend on war no more. O Lord, our monarch bless with strength and righteousness. Long may she reign, her heart inspire and move with wisdom from above, and in a nation's love her throne maintain. May just and righteous laws uphold the public cause, and bless our isle, home of the brave and free. Thou land of liberty, we pray that still on thee kind heaven may smile. Nor on this land alone, but be God's mercies known from shore to shore. Lord, make the nations see that men should brothers be and form one family, the world-wide awe. Well, it's wonderful.
Just idolatry, really.
It's obviously just
idolatry of the nation.
Totally. Obviously, just love our neighbour. You know.
Yeah. If all you needed to do is love people. But sorry, don't love people to the extent that you want the nation you're in to be good.
Of course.
That would be a bad.
That would be ridiculous.
Loving of your neighbour.
That would be ridiculous. Can't you see? Get Chris Candy on the phone. Come on.
Exactly. But that's and not to go to your point much earlier about love. It's like that is also how you make a Christian nation.
Yeah.
Like you do live out the Good Samaritan, and we're probably not all very good at doing that.
Yeah.
But you do. Like show the radical love of Christ to people. That's what it means. But it also means loving them in the other direction as well, which means going to reach them. I was just shocked and really quite appalled at some of the reactions to Brett even on this. Like, how dare you be there? You just think, what do you think of that crowd? I don't know if they could hear them through the recording or not on this recording, but just it's almost like I think Tommy Robinson's a bit of a Robin Hood type figure. And it's like there's this crowd who he's a man of the people. People love him. Yes, of course. Like he's not a Christian, but I think he's increasingly pro-Christian. And most of the people there are pro-Christian. They don't actually understand Christianity. A lot of them. Some of them probably do a bit more than others, but most of them had some kind of Sunday school upbringing. Probably they sung hymns in primary school and their CV school. They look at the nation. They look at the Church of England. They think this is terrible. They would be amening everything Brett says about challenging the CV, like as the cult of England. And they actually are. They are hungry, and yet there's a hearing. There's a harvest there, but we're just unwilling. The workers are few, and people don't want to go and reach them because they're scared of the reputational damage that might cause them.
I was reminded of our previous conversations about reaching men of the right. You know, even as I watched it the first time, let alone the second time. I think you're right. I mean, there has to be someone who's willing to go to those places and say something. He was much more confessional than, obviously, because I had only watched it the first time with a little bit. Listening to it again fresh then, you think he was much more confessional. He was saying, you need to turn to Jesus. We need to repent of our sins. Quoting Chronicles, we need to repent of our sins and He will heal thy land, etc. And again, will there be some emphases that we disagree with? Yes, of course. Would there be some question of of I don't know where the accent is placed, or could you gone further and mention, given an actual gospel message or so? Yeah, very possibly.
UCCF would have castigated it.
But are those, as you said about just in general, other questions, of course. But I was thinking, yeah, he's there and we're not, and he's there and most church leaders would never go there. Now, does he have to be careful? Yeah, if I'm not one to talk like that, though. I'm not in his social circle, but I'm sure he's aware of that there's a need to be careful as you go through these networks and watch yourself, and that goes without saying. The fact is he's there and other people aren't, and how can they hear if they have not had someone tell them?
Yeah,
and that applies to right-wing degenerates and reprobates or whatever the left want to call them as much as anyone else.
Yeah, completely right. And I think that even if they kind of care, you're right to say there could be a danger, but I kind of think even the notion of this, again, the Voldemort danger of the right, I mean, how big an issue really? Like, I think this is, again, part of the floor, the kind of underfloor heating that we've been given. This is just what you have to believe, that the biggest threat at all times is some kind of far-right extremist uprising where people start going, we're just going to make racism great again or something. That's kind of what they think when they think of make America great again or make Britain great again. But it's literally called Great Britain. Yeah. like there was a real confidence in Britishness and British identity. That's why these immigration issues, which tend to connect with people on the right more, because they care about their British identity. They look at their history and they go, this was better. And Christianity somehow is bound up in all of that. And so they're like, we want Christianity. We don't really know how, but we want it because we want, it's part of who we are as British people.
And isn't it weird
somehow.
that a lot of the left, even sort of, as you say, Guardian reading evangelicals would say, yeah, but we're not going to give it to you. We're not going to give you evangelicalism. We're not going to give you Christianity. No. We're not going to give it to you. We're not going to give it to you.
Yeah. What we'll do is we'll if you come and submit,
you come to us,
show fealty to us.
Yes, exactly. If you talk like us and are decent like us, talk in our policy, talk in our categories, then we'll give you Christianity. Yeah. But if not, I mean, how dare you even go talk to them?
Yeah. How dare you build bridges? So Tim Keller, I think we must have mentioned this several times, but Tim Keller's told evangelicals for years to build bridges to people. So go and do what Paul did in Acts 17, but we don't do it when it comes to the right. So we don't. So Brett Murphy was doing that. Arguably, he's doing Acts 17. Some could say, well, couldn't you just gone and not shown support for Tommy Robinson because he swears and he's not a Christian? And so no, it's actually the particularity of some of these issues is what preaching, what grounds preaching. So if we preach into the abstract, into the ether, and go, I'm going to talk about my doctrine up here somewhere in the sky. I'm never going to apply it to a real situation. So it is a bit odd. Yeah, it could make people think that Jesus is on the side of Tommy Robinson in every respect. Sure. But it's actually okay for a Christian to come up publicly and say, free Tommy Robinson, because they believe that this cause is just. And that people on the so-called moderate middle, who are actually on the left, they're non-extremists, they're happy to talk about social issues and particularize them and say, this ought to happen, whether it's like free Palestine or whether it's food banks matter or whether it's something about climate change. They particularize it. And so this is just another version.
Well, Steve Chalke was happy to cozy up with Blair and others, wasn't he? I mean, that's okay.
Yeah, that's
again,
kind of nationalism.
We smuggle in the categories from outside and we assume their framing. And in this instance, someone could say, yeah, but this policy, you wouldn't associate with some people. You're right. Okay, fair enough. In extremis, you would definitely say, okay, certain kinds of people, certain kinds of gatherings, you wouldn't go. That would be more unwise to speak than not to speak. But we're talking, as you say, about the particularity of this one.
Absolutely.
And my understanding, I'm happy for someone to correct me, is that these Tommy Robinson rallies have not been violent in the extreme at all. Yeah. Have not been violent. Have been more, they've not been Nazi-ish. They've not been hateful or anything like that. If they had, I've certainly not seen any reporting on it. In fact, I've seen the exact opposite. So we're talking about, in this instance, of if someone, let's say, if that phone rang Aaron tomorrow and said at the next one, would you come and say something? I think if my phone rang and said likewise, I would probably do it. I would almost certainly do it. Yeah. And I would hope that in my preparation, I would be as clear, how should I put it, as simply Christian as Brett intended to be, rather than sort of fudging it, and in the effort to look clever to people who don't care what about those people gathered in front of them.
And also probably wouldn't understand, not to put down, not to assume that actually not, the crowd are likely to not be educated, but they're just going to not appreciate.
Yeah, they're not going to assume Christian categories in the same way.
Exactly, the nuanced posturing that we kind of would have in our head. So there's something about proclamation publicly which does require that sharper edge, which we've been unwilling to. And I think fundamentally, as we kind of draw it to a close, it's like, to me, a perennial scripture that comes to mind is Luke 18:11. I think I've got that right. With the Pharisee and the tax collector, and where you think of that simple-minded beating his breast and going, have mercy on me, I'm a sinner, is what let's say that's what the right winger says today. That's what the kind of person going there. You hope. I mean, of course, there's going to be self-righteous people who think they're Christian because they are on the right. On the right, they think, that just means we're automatically Christian. Of course, that's a problem. They've got to preach. That's why Brett's there giving out Bibles and preaching the gospel to them, or at least proclaiming Christ's lordship, which is a good start, even if you don't get to covering penal substitution and grace, etc. But it's about as you say, the Pharisee who comes along and says, I thank you that I'm not like that man, an extremist, an anti-Islamist, someone who's going to make my colleagues kind of frown at me or raise their eyebrows at me, that kind of thing. And so as we draw that to a close, as this room gets invaded by who knows, we'll kind of leave it there. Hope you found this helpful, listeners, and we'll see you next time, maybe or maybe not, with Tom or somebody else, but there we are. Be strong in the Lord and the strength of his might. Defy the devil and act like men. Love the brotherhood. Fear God. Christ is Lord. God save the King. It's been that good fight, and we'll see you next time.